certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
The night Sarah Spiers vanished, she called for a cab. Today, for the first time, we hear from the taxi driver dispatched to pick her up. Welcome to Claremont in Conversation. I'm Natalie Bonjolo, joined by criminal lawyer Damien Cripps, and from court, Tim Clark. Tim, you know, last week we heard that voice recording of Sarah Spiers calling for a cab, and today you got the next piece to this puzzle.
Yes, so we heard, as you said in your intro, Nat, we heard from the man who basically hit the button on his onboard computer on that fare after that call was made, and was literally just around the corner. He said it basically took him 2 minutes from where he was to where he was supposed to be. And in that time between that call and when he got there, when he did get there, there was no one there. And obviously we now know that the person that was supposed to be there has never been seen again. And
was he asked if that was unusual for a fare not to be there, or, you know, do they radio back and say there's a no-show or anything like that?
Well, not really. So Mr. Krupnik, he's a Czech gentleman who had been driving cabs for many years. He said he knew the area, obviously, as most taxi drivers back in that era would have done at sort of 2 a.m. on a Friday, Saturday or Sunday night. That would be your bread and butter as a taxi driver. So what he said was when he approached the corner and didn't see anyone standing there, he did a left and did another left, basically back towards the entertainment area in Claremont, including Club Bayview, and very quickly picked up another fare. During Miss Barbagallo's opening last week, she said that ironically, one of the people in that group of three that he picked up was actually an acquaintance of Sarah, and they asked to go to Mosman Park, which is where Sarah was obviously aiming to get to as well. And so, once again, these little tiny sliding doors moments, whether Mr. Krupnik had, gone a little bit faster, or got a red light, not a green light, or a green light, not a red light. And then, as it turned out, Sarah wasn't there when he went past. But then the next witness that we heard from this afternoon was in the same area, almost exactly the same time of night, and did see a young lady leaning on a Telstra bollard on that corner at almost exactly the same time.
And so, who was this guy?
So this was a chap, Mr. Panel, Alec Panel, who's giving evidence from the UK, and he'd been out with a couple of his mates to the Conti and Club Bayview. They must have been the busiest nightclubs in Western Australia that night, because we've heard from so many people who were there or very close to. And he had got into his friend was driving that night, so they got into his car and they drove down the street, and the lone female that they saw standing there was so notable, at least to the driver, that he actually commented to Mr. Panel, look at that young woman. And so he did, and he saw a slim, late teen, early 20 young lady with her arms crossed, looking like she was waiting for someone or looking out for someone, in exactly the exact same spot where she said she was going to be when she called the taxi rank. So, and so many years on to hear those, once again, those intimate details about a moment in time that has basically captivated the state ever since is, it's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I can't help but wonder why. I mean, why was that memorable back then? Because like you said, that I'm from that vintage and I went out in that area during those years as well. And there was so many people walking around and looking for cabs at that time of the night. It wasn't unusual. And I can't help but wonder why that kind of stood out to them.
Well, I take it that as the investigation as Sarah's disappearance became obviously critical for the police and the investigation sort of wound up, the police were certainly able to obviously track down the taxi driver through their Swan Taxis records about who had taken that fare, and then I'm assuming as the sort of canvas for information went round, it must have jogged something in Mr. Punnell's and his friends' memories, and so they made a statement as well. So and then and that sort of that whole era, which we've sort of known about but not known the details of for so long, is now just moment by moment and hour by hour being laid out by the prosecutors in front of our eyes.
Yeah, and you did hear from more of these Telstra Living Witnesses today as well, and it really does give such an incredible feeling of what it was like back then, because some of their accounts are really chilling.
Yes, I mean chilling and of another era. I know Damien's nightclubbing days are legendary around the legal circle, so he's probably done a bit more of it than I did. But and the fact that we've heard previously, even the last two, after the two girls were missing and then three girls were missing, there were still people hitchhiking and getting around Perth with late at night, sort of slightly intoxicated with no shoes, and the last living witness of the day and the last witness of the day was possibly one of the more interesting ones, because she gave an account of the night after Sarah went missing, when she was on Stirling Highway by the Hungry Jacks, which we've heard so much about, and she was basically, how she described being eyeballed by the driver of a white Telstra car, who'd pulled over and was basically staring straight at her for a long enough time for her to get concerned and basically tell him or ask him quite loudly, "What do you want? What are you doing?" And she was of such interest to the police that in late '98, when obviously the triple murder investigation was in full swing, she made an identikit or gave the police a description of the man that she said she saw in this car and had unnerved her. And we got to see that identikit and today in court, and I've got to say it didn't bear much resemblance to Mr. Edwards, the accused, either then or now. So that sort of throws another little spanner in the works of the prosecution. And if you remember back to Mr. Jovich's opening, he said, "Oh, well, look, the prosecution want to paint this neat little, pretty little picture of all these, really regular, common sightings of Telstra cars, and the man was basically the same looking." And seeing that identikit in glorious black and white today, that was one of the rough edges that Mr. Jovich said that he would point towards within this so-called living witness package of evidence that prosecutors are continuing to bring.
So, Damien, would that be quite important to Mr. Jovich, that identikit, and that it doesn't resemble the accused?
Well, Tim, I do really appreciate your reference to my nightclub days. I don't have any nightclub days. I was always out seeing bands, I should say. But in response to that, Nat, when I try to think about a case like this or any case that I would be working on, I look at the position of the prosecution as needing to build a jigsaw, and they need to put all the pieces together so that the jury or the judge or whoever is making the decision can see the full picture. So what Tim's talking about there, and all the listeners will be experiencing it, and if they're listening every day, they'll be hearing slowly but surely little pieces of the puzzle coming together. Now remember that the puzzle, in my view, just my view, that the puzzle has to be completed. It can't have missing pieces. So when we get to a point where we have an identikit put forward which doesn't resemble the accused person, if you think about it in the jigsaw terms of things, there's a piece that kind of doesn't fit. Yeah. So it does work for the prosecution, but I think it's also important to think about it in the manner that you need to get all the pieces to fit, but just because one piece doesn't fit doesn't mean it might not go somewhere else. So it might be an issue of that location not being right. And I know, because I always try to think about what it's like for people who don't work in the law or have not been journalists and have worked around the courts for a long time, and how they might be thinking about the way things are unfolding. And it's daunting to try to, if someone was listening to this podcast, and I know a lot of people are, and people are trying to keep up with everything that's going on, and Tim and Nat and everyone involved's doing a great job of doing that. But if you think about it as the jigsaw puzzle, that identity kit is just one piece that didn't fit in, and perhaps it comes in later on.
The woman who was basically, stared down by this man in a Telstra car, what was she like in court today? What was her demeanour when she was giving evidence?
Oh, I mean, she was very sure of the evidence that she was giving, and today and at the time. But there were, you have to say, there were significant discrepancies between her description of what the man looked like, of the car. She said it was definitely not a wagon, where, as we know, all the other witnesses have said it was. So, I mean, she was very certain of what she was saying. But whether it was completely accurate or not, whether her memories, I mean, obviously her memories faded now, but this was based also on statements that she'd given at the time. She was certain of her recollection, and as I'm sure Damien's encountered numerous times, people can be very sure of what they remember, but whether they're remembering right or not is another matter completely.
Yeah.
So, Tim, just on that point, it's a really, really important thing to remember, is that what people give evidence about is their version of events, and their version of events is what their mind positively tells them happened. So it's not always the case, in my experience, it's only my experience, that people are lying. It might be the case that Nat says the car was red, and she genuinely believes the car was red. It was a year ago that this car accident happened, and I say that the car was blue, and it genuinely was. So I think that's an important point for people to remember, that, I think studies have shown that people's memories will let them down.
Yes. We know that this young woman didn't get into the car, but you heard today from a young woman who did.
Yes, so that was another of the Telstra Living Witnesses, and she was basically the friend of a witness that gave evidence yesterday. You might remember we touched on the lady that got into the back of a Telstra car and remembered seeing a lot of wires and a lot of tools, and then her friend basically yanked her out. Well, the friend, the witness today was the yanker.
Right.
She was the lady that got into the front of the car. She wasn't. She basically described they'd had a big night out. Double figures of drinks, middies as we call them in here in Western Australia. That's a sort of half pint or a schooner, or not a full drink, but plenty of them anyway. Right. And she described how they tried to get a cab, failed. This car pulled over. She couldn't remember the conversation that preceded them getting into the car, but she certainly said she remembered getting into the car, and then they drove off. And then her next distinct memory, the way she described it, was she just had a very strong instinct that they needed to exit the vehicle. So that's what she did. She told him to stop, or we might actually go to Club Bayview, if you don't mind, we'll just pull over here. She got around to the other side, yanked her friend out of the car, and he drove off. But unfortunately, you might remember from yesterday's podcast, the lady in the back, Miss Smith, had just been about to say something that her friend had said to her about what the man had done to basically precede this action. But unfortunately, the witness today, she couldn't actually remember distinctly, or more precisely, couldn't remember accurately enough to trust her account to tell the court what it was that he said or done that had made her feel uneasy. But she certainly remembered that there was that gut instinct, that very primal instinct that she described of wanting to get out of the car, and so that's what she did.
Yeah, because I think the only words, from what I've looked through and read, the only words that the friend yesterday, which was Trilby, had said was something like, "That man was."
Yeah.
And that was it.
That was this sort of, she described basically how she got yanked out of the car. "What are you doing, Annabelle? Why have you done that?" And then she was just about to go and say, "My friend told me that man was ... But as Damien will much better describe to me, hearsay evidence is something that you've heard someone say, not something you've said yourself or seen with your own eyes." And so the judge stopped her before, or the court stopped her before she could say it. And then unfortunately the witness today either couldn't remember sufficiently well enough to trust herself to say it under oath. And so she didn't. But the overriding impression you got from that witness was that there was an atmosphere or an instinct that she had in that car after quite a short distance of it moving that said to her, "We need to get out." And so that's what she did.
That must have just played on her mind for so many years.
Well, that's the underlying sort of tension to all this living witness evidence. Obviously, I mean, we've got to point out it's not been proved yet that this is Mr. Edwards, and I don't think it could ever possibly be proved conclusively that it is him. But as we said before, it's the weight, it's the coincidence of it all. But you join the dots, and you do, and you certainly think, I wonder what these women were thinking at the time. Yeah. They were obviously thinking enough to give a statement to the police, which is not a light thing to do. And those statements were obviously given in the background of girls going missing. So what they thought then, and what they must still think now, having to give evidence, in front of, in some cases, the man that the prosecution say, "We think he was the man who picked you up, and we also think he's committed these 3 horrible crimes."
Tim, just in relation to those 2 girls that you were talking about there, obviously I haven't been in the court like you have and haven't heard their evidence and experienced the room when they're giving their evidence. But one thing that comes to my mind, which is quite interesting, is that these 2 witnesses have been led by the prosecution potentially to show that a man that was working for Telstra was driving around in his van picking people up. And that certainly has an interesting suggestion with it. But I prompt people to think about the reverse of that as well, is that from what I can understand, I wasn't there, didn't hear the evidence, but what I can understand is he let them out and they walked off. And
correct.
He drove away. So sometimes it gets lost in a lot of the momentum of what's trying to be achieved with the jigsaw puzzle. I keep going back to it. That effectively, perhaps the simple generosity of a human being who stopped to pick somebody up might be getting lost in something that terrible was going on in the area at the time.
But I take your point, Damien, of course, because, we've obviously got a bloke called Lance Williams who was out there thinking he was doing the right thing, driving around, helping or wanting to help vulnerable women. And, of course, he was then hounded by police for decades.
I'm glad you brought that up, Nat, because I think that's completely relevant to say. Not legally, it's about the way you view things. It's like Lance Williams went through what he went through back then simply because he was trying to help people. Yeah. So good thoughts to have in amongst all the other moral and legally testing questions that are ongoing here.
Yeah. There was a lot of detail today about Bradley Edwards' employment history too, wasn't there, Tim?
Yes. So this is part of the glamour of court reporting that we sat through about 303 hours of evidence about pay slips and work records and leave applications. And someone very senior from Telstra was called in to do it. You've flown over from Melbourne for the purpose, but there was a purpose to it. Obviously, I'm being flippant, and it basically went to Mr. Edwards' work history. and when he first was employed, when he was promoted, and when he was taken leave, and what his responsibilities were, his qualifications, and that type of thing. And it might sound very dry, and it was, but it was there for a purpose. 3 really. It showed that when Mr. Edwards was on leave, mainly. And we heard earlier this week that when Telstra employees that had or were in a sort of part payment plan on their car, so their work car became their leisure car at certain times, if they were on leave for more than 2 weeks, that car had to go into the depot. They couldn't take it on holiday with them. And so the prosecution would want to say, well, Mr. Edwards wasn't on leave for the times around the murders, and so he would have had access to his car, which is obviously of critical importance, particularly Jane and Sarah, because they are then going to point to fibres and the like that they say meant that the girls were in that car. There was also the other interesting sideline was they had all these records about Mr. Edwards' leave and applications and cars and promotions and work records and applications, but they didn't have any record, not one piece of paper that said that they were aware that he'd attacked someone while working for Telstra at Hollywood Hospital in May 1990. So the payroll manager from Telstra, who was very proud of his archive or his company's archiving, was the last question he was asked. Do you have any records of that? And
no.
He said just one word, no.
I just still find this extraordinary because I just think, if Damien, I went to your workplace and I was representing my company and I decided to bop you in the nose and was charged with common assault, I just can't fathom that my employer wouldn't have been informed of that.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit, Nat, just in relation to that, and I might be able to put some insight into that. In 1990, and Tim, you might have some information on this as well, not just for me, but for the listeners as well. How would it be that Telstra would become aware of that?
Well, that's a very good question. He was on a job and had been on a job at the Hollywood Hospital, but he was arrested on the day. The leave records today showed that he took 1 hour's unpaid leave the following day after his arrest. He pleaded guilty on the 11th of May, which is 4 days after, and then there was a month leading up to that, to his sentencing. He'd spoken to 2 psychologists in that time, as we learned yesterday. He was sentenced to 2 years probation, placed on a sex offender program. Within all that, you might think that someone from Hollywood might give Telstra a call, someone from the police might Telstra a call, but who knows? We don't know. We haven't had any evidence, and there certainly wasn't any evidence on the Telstra records that they had been informed.
So he only took a day of leave after?
No, 1 hour.
Only 1 hour of
leave the day after. Yes.
So my point is that back in 1990, it was a completely different system. There was no internet. The court reporting was set up differently, and it's possible that he was at the job on his own, and the incident took place in a time when there wasn't a lot of people around, especially not his work colleagues, and he simply just went through the process of getting a lawyer, going and entering his plea and going through all the process. A lot of that information would have been privileged, the hospitals. It's very different now, though. I mean, I think if you find, and most listeners will know, that in your place of employment these days, you are required to provide a police clearance on a yearly basis. I'm not sure that would have been the case back then.
But presumably you're out doing your job, you don't come back because the cops have come and dragged you away to charge you. Yeah, so doesn't someone notice that you don't come back to work that day?
Well, he was working off-site, obviously, and had been for a little bit, I think. The assault was around about 4 o'clock, so it was late in the afternoon. So as we learned yesterday, the assault was quick. The security guard basically caught him red-handed, or certainly light red-handed, straight after. The police were then called. So what's to say that, and this is obviously all speculation, we haven't heard anything about it, but what's to say the police didn't take him down, do their interview? He was, we do know he missed picking up his first wife at the time, because she said that in her evidence, and so that's 5:30. What's to say that he wasn't at home by 7 o'clock, and then, basically took an hours of unpaid leave to try and explain himself to his wife the day after, and then went back to work. We just don't know.
Were there any other sick days that were significant?
No, none that we could see, and certainly none around the times of the murders. So, I mean, and that was the other, like trying to pinpoint his whereabouts, obviously around the specific days of when the girl's missing, and also Karrakatta. I mean, that was the third reason for bringing that evidence today.
Damien, we've got a question from a listener, which you may be able to answer. They're wanting to know what happens at lunchtime when the court's adjourned. Does the accused go and sit with his lawyer? Does he go down and get some lunch? What happens to him in those breaks?
So there's a little bit of freedom involved in that, Nat. So, essentially, for me as a lawyer, I would always ask my client if they wanted me to come and see them. It's available for the lawyer to go and see their client, but some food's provided for the client as well, or the accused person, and they can have some lunch. But it's not uncommon for counsel lawyers to go and meet with their clients during the lunch break, because a lot's happened in the morning, so they can use that opportunity to just clarify a few instructions. So it depends on the environment, but it is available for them to meet.
So it's quite
an important time as well, Damien, because access to clients otherwise, particularly as such a high security, sort of highly visible client that Mr. Edwards would be, access to him otherwise is quite restricted or quite hard to get.
Well, at this time, if I try to piece that together, it'd be virtually impossible, because there'd be no visiting hours for him at the prisons, for him after court or before court. There'd have to be a special application made for that. So that would leave the weekends and any breaks in the court time, or ask for him to be held back at the courts for that simple purpose. I don't know the specifics in relation to this matter, but the proposition you say, Tim, is right.
Tim, is the public gallery as packed this week as it was last week?
Not quite as packed, Nat, but I mean, as you say, there's the premiere of any big show is always full, isn't it? And no, the gallery hasn't been as full this week, but certainly vastly more populated than any usual trial, even a high-profile one. There are dozens of people still in the court, just interested observers, apart from all of us media types, the police, and obviously the families.
They're still attending, the victims' families?
But once again, not as in bigger numbers. Dennis Glennon was here again today, as were some other sort of extended family of some of the other victims. But, I mean, as we've mentioned so many times, it's such a long process, such a grueling process, such an emotional process. You wouldn't really expect everyone to be there every day.
Nat, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
A lot of people have contacted me with a lot of questions.
Yes.
Maybe it'd be better if they directed the questions to the podcast generally. Is that possible?
Yes. So we actually have a new email address where people who are listening will be able to contact us directly, and we'll all be able to see those questions that come through. So that email address is claremontpodcast@wanews.com.au. So Claremont Podcast, one word, at wanews.com.au. Any questions you have, any feedback, that'll come through to all of us, Tim, myself, Damien, and we'll try and answer them in the following day's podcast, or if not, the day after. But at some point we will get to those questions that you've sent through, and we do have quite a few who are still waiting, so we'll get to you out there, everyone. Thank you both. Thanks for your hard yards today in the court, Tim.
Oh, pleasure, mate.
Thanks, Damien.
I was doing hard yards as well, in a different courtroom somewhere, and I thought of both of you, but I did do some hard yards, and it's good to be here. Thanks for having me on board.
Thanks to you both, and we hope to have your company tomorrow for day 9.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.